So for this week, you read a chapter in your textbook about speaking and listening. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about an instructional strategy you can use called literature circles, which is a fantastic way of including speaking and listening in your classroom. So in fact, literature circles are a really great way of integrating several of the language arts areas. For one, literature circles involve reading a book. They involve writing and responding in relation to the book that's being read, and certainly they involve speaking your mind about the book in a group of people, and it also involves listening to what other people have to say about a book. And certainly you could also find ways of incorporating viewing and visually representing with literature circles. For example, with a literature circle, if students are reading a book and they finish it, they might create some sort of project, like maybe a book trailer about the book that they read in order to advertise their book and encourage other students in the class to read it. And certainly creating a book trailer, which is basically like a movie trailer but for a book, that would involve viewing and visually representing. So literature circles are really a great way of addressing all the different language arts areas for sure. So I know that in this class you already have some knowledge about literature circles because we've been doing them online in our class in a modified form, from what I'm going to describe here. So basically a literature circle is a small group of students who meet to discuss a book. And literature circles are very student-centered. The teacher is not heavily involved in a literature circle. So as students are meeting in their literature circle groups, the teacher is walking around, sitting in on discussions, perhaps taking notes about students' behaviors, but this teacher is not directing the discussions. The teacher is really just a fly on the wall if he or she is sitting in on the discussion. So students run literature circles themselves. It's not something that the teacher runs. I mean, the teacher has to certainly facilitate the literature circle organizations and kind of get them organized, but once that occurs, the students run the show. So they're a very student-centered form of practice. And when we create literature circle groups, the groups are not based at all on a student's reading proficiency. We're not grouping students according to whether they're really advanced readers or struggling readers. Groups are actually formed based on students' interest in reading a particular book. For example, in our class several weeks ago, actually, it was more than that. I forget, we're at the end of the semester. But quite some time ago, I gave you a list of books to select from, and you guys told me which books that you were most interested in reading. So based on the choices you gave me, I placed you into groups with other people who had similar interests. And when we use literature circles in the classroom with elementary students, the same thing goes. You give students a range of books to choose from, and you organize groups according to what students want to read. So there's a really strong element of choice with literature circles. I know that with our class, when you read books like El Deafo or The Family Romanov or Dead End and Norvelt, you had choice in which books you wanted to read. But some books we did read as a whole class, like Al Capone Does My Shirts and Claudette Colvin. So that element of choice was not really evident with Al Capone or with Claudette Colvin, but it was certainly evident with the other books that you guys selected to read. So with literature circles, and this is something we did not do in our class, but this is something you could do with elementary students, students assume particular roles within their literature circle group, and they complete role sheets, which I'm going to show you shortly, in order to structure the discussion. But role sheets are supposed to really just be a scaffold to help students become familiar with having a good discussion. It's meant to help students launch their discussion. But once students become proficient with having a good discussion, they can dispose of their role sheets, and instead of doing role sheets, they can use a literature response journal to structure their discussion instead. And I'm going to talk more about that momentarily. So in terms of literature circle roles, these are ones that are fairly common, and sometimes people call them different things. One role is a discussion director, and that's a student who is in charge of writing questions and posing them to group members discussion, and the discussion director also keeps the group on task. Now, in the literature circles we've done in CIR 306, the discussion director is really kind of like the person who's acting as the group leader. Every week, people had different turns, taking turns as the group leader. And all of you certainly wrote questions for your literature circle discussions, but the group leader kind of kept you on task. So that's why earlier when I said that we sort of did literature circles, we did them, but not quite in the same way I'm describing them here. I did a modified version since we're an online class and you guys are adults, not elementary kids, obviously, so ours were somewhat different. So the way I'm describing literature circles here is really how we might use them in a K-12 setting. So the vocabulary enricher is a student who identifies words that might be interesting or difficult and defines them and writes sentences to explain the meaning of the word and shares that with the group members. And I actually prefer the term word wizard over vocabulary enricher just because it is a lot more fun. I would rather be a wizard than an enricher. I don't know about you. And then we have the literary luminary, and that's a student who identifies passages from the book that are really interesting. Like maybe they're very well written, or perhaps they're confusing or whatever. And the student makes note of those and shares them with the group members and then discusses the reaction to those particular passages. The checker is a student that makes sure that all students have come to the literature circle meeting, and the checker ensures that all students have completed their roll sheets or have prepared in some other way for the literature circle discussion. Because remember, these are student-centered, so the teacher isn't doing this. The students have responsibility for it. The artful artist, which I found was always a popular role, is a student who takes a scene from the book that has significance and illustrates it and then shares that with group members. And then the connector is a student who generates text-to-text, text-to-self, and text-to-world connections to share with group members. So with literature circle roles like this, if you do a search on the internet, you can certainly find tons of different literature circle rule sheets, but I do like the ones from readwritethink.org just because I think they're well done and they look nice. Here's an example of a rule sheet for a literary luminary. If you go to readwritethink.org, follow the link I've provided on the slide, or just Google readwritethink and literature circles, it'll come right up. But you can download these role sheets for free. This is literary luminary, and you can see that the student who takes this role is expected to identify 4 different passages, identify the page number and the paragraph number, and then explain why he or she picked that particular passage. Like maybe it was surprising or funny, or made the student think a good deal. So that's just one example of a role sheet. And there are tons of them freely available online. They are not hard to find at all. So as I mentioned, usually role sheets are just used as a scaffold when students are just getting started with literature circles. You don't have to keep using them. Once students feel confident with literature circle discussions, they can use something called a response journal instead. So what they can do is just keep a journal, and it can be very simple, a notebook or whatever. And after they finish reading, a selection of their book, they can write down their response. They can write down what was interesting to them, what was thought-provoking. They can write down any questions or connections they have, and then they can bring that response journal to the discussion. And the discussion based on the response journals is much more natural. So students are just taking the response journal and referring to it for talking points. So the discussion can go in all sorts of different directions, but the response journal just gives them something to talk from in case the discussion stalls. So that's really the goal of literature circles, is to get students in a place where they can talk about books very naturally, where they can pick up and sit with their peers and talk about books, just like adults in a book club would do. And sometimes another thing I've seen, and when I was a student teacher in 4th grade years ago, my mentor teacher had her students do this. She actually had students, as they were reading their literature circle books, they would take a stack of sticky notes, and anytime they had like a question or an interesting thought or something that they wanted to say, they would put a sticky note right in their book. And that way, when they met for their literature circle discussions, they could just open up their books, look for their sticky notes, and use those sticky notes as like talking points during the discussion. So how do you implement a literature circle from the perspective of a teacher? So for one, you make text selections. So depending on the size of your class and the number of groups you plan to have, you want to select maybe like say 6 to 8 books, that students can choose from. And then what students do is they sign up for the book that they want to read and discuss. And it would be a good idea to have students sign up for like their first choice, second choice, and third choice, because sometimes what happens is only like one kid is interested in reading a certain book. And then what do you do unless the student has indicated his or her second choice? So it's a good idea to have them like rank the books if possible. Then if you decide you want to do roles with literature circles, you assign students in each group a role and distribute the role sheets. Then the students meet together in their groups and they determine how much of the reading they want to complete for the next class meeting. So really they're determining their homework. Like, what are we going to read tonight? Chapter 1 and 2, or are we going to read chapters 1 through 5? It's really up to them. Then what students do is they do the reading from their literature circle book independently, and they also complete their role sheets if you're using the role sheet, or they write responses in a literature response journal, depending on how you're doing it. Then students come to class the next day and they meet in their groups to discuss the text using their role sheets or their response journals or their sticky notes as talking points. And then students, when they're finished discussing the text, they determine, again, how much do they want to read of the book for the next day. And then students also rotate roles. So if a student has the role of being discussion director on Monday, that student might switch to the role of checker the next day and the role of literary luminary the next day on Wednesday. So students don't stick with the same role throughout the entire literature circle discussion. They actually switch, so they have chances to do different things within their groups. So sometimes when students finish reading a literature circle book, they complete some sort of project about it, but that's, really up to you as a teacher. Like I mentioned before, they might do a book talk in front of the class in which they try to sell the book to other students, or they might create a book trailer, which is like a movie trailer. So lots of different things that can be done. So in terms of evaluating literature circles, certainly as a teacher, you want to make some observations about how students are doing. Like if you notice a student is hanging back and not participating, that's something you want to note and something you want to address with the students. But generally, literature circles are evaluated by the students themselves. Oftentimes, students self-assess their performance in a literature circle group, and you need to encourage them to be honest. So they fill out like a self-reflection sheet like this one, and they consider their behavior within the literature circle meeting. And they might do this following every meeting. Another way to do it is to have students assess each other. So if like Bob, Tim, and Susan are in a group, Susan is going to evaluate how Bob and Tim did in the literature circle group, and likewise for Bob and Tim. So that's how, and we want to have students evaluate themselves and evaluate their peers in order to hold them accountable for contributing to the discussion, for doing the reading, and for completing their role sheet. So, you're kind of using the power of peer pressure and group accountability in order to get students to participate honestly in their literature circle discussions. So in terms of making your literature circle groups run smoothly, you certainly need to model what an appropriate discussion about literature is with the class. For example, you might have interactive read-alouds where you're reading a book aloud to students and you pause and you engage them in discussion. Another thing you can do is called a fishbowl. So if you have a group of students who are really strong talkers, what you might have them do is sit at the center of the classroom and have them engage in a discussion about a book or some other sort of text that they've read, and all the other students in the class sit around the outside of the group of students who are discussing. That's why it's called a fishbowl, because people are on the outside looking in. And what you have students do is learn from the students who are engaging in the discussion. Like, what are they doing to sustain their conversation? What's going well? And you might also want to have students acknowledge their contributions to literature circle discussions by encouraging them to give compliments in front of the whole class. All right. So what I would like you to do is actually spend some time watching a couple of video clips that I'm going to post to Blackboard. This video clip looking into literature circles, you're going to have to access by using your library login, which is the same login you use for SOAR and Blackboard and whatnot. And then this one from YouTube. And what I'd like you to do is watch these two videos, and I want you to consider the questions on this graphic organizer, like what makes a good literature circle discussion and what do students do to sustain their discussion. So in a sense, we're kind of doing a fishbowl here. I'd like you to look at what's going on in these videos and consider what are the elements of a good discussion and how might you apply that to your future teaching practice. So again, you don't have to, I'd like you to do this exercise, but you don't have to submit it to me. I trust that you're going to do it and learn from it. So if you have any questions about literature circles, please feel free to let me know, and thank you.